Hi, I'm Jennifer with Mission Advancement, and I'm so glad you're joining us for our Summer Break Series, Season 2. This year, we're taking a summer school approach and bringing you a virtual classroom focusing on some of the core principles in fundraising that we teach day in and day out. So you'll hear from our team this summer around the story that you tell, around the leadership in your organization that tells that story, the prospect pool, and ultimately the plan you create to execute the work. We're looking forward to bringing you new information every week as you're sitting back during your summer break, planning for your fundraising operation in the year to come. So thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoy all the episodes of our Summer Break Series, Season 2.
Greetings, I'm Schuyler and I'm the founder of Mission Advancement. Welcome to Season 2 of our Summer Break Series. And you may recall, if you were one of those that watched the episodes last year anyway, we were in a slightly less formal setting with beach balls and all kinds of things kind of flying around us. So we're a little bit more formal, but still somewhat relaxed in the way we're doing this. And this year we're going to do a series of 4 episodes that really focus on the 4 main building blocks of what comprise every funding operation that exists in the nonprofit world. They are, quickly, the story that you have to tell, the audience that you have to tell the story to, otherwise known as prospects, the storytellers, who are typically your staff and leaders, and 4 is the plan that kind of sticks those 3 elements together. And you could look and dissect any development operation based on those 4 elements. That's why we're going to kind of dissect each one of those elements in each one of our episodes. Today we're taking on the first one, which is telling your story. The story that you have to tell in the many different ways that you tell it. Sometimes it's called the case for organizations, but anyway, more to come on that. Joining me in this particular episode is Scott Taylor. You may remember he's reprising his appearance in this episode. He leads our client service operation for Mission Advancement. And Katie Schleve, who is a newer member of our team, but we're grateful to have her, and she's already making a great impact on so many of our clients. So hey, let me dive right in to this, because telling the story to our clients, telling the story that our clients have to tell is sometimes more complex than it needs to be. I'm just curious, you guys have been around enough nonprofit organizations and seen how they operate, but share with me a little bit of kind of some of the mistakes that you've seen client organizations make in telling their story. Scott, why don't you go first?
Yeah, sure. I think probably one of the most notable mistakes that organizations are making in telling their story is too much information or not enough information. Oh, here's our one-line elevator pitch, but it doesn't actually convey why it's important. I know we're going to get into it later, but the relevant pieces that really make a story. And the other side of that I mentioned is just the too much. Right? Oh, I'm going to tell you everything, and 20 minutes later, I didn't hear anything you had to say. So, missed the point altogether.
So true. I can think of several examples in my mind right now of those very things. Katie, how about you?
Absolutely. Well, I think one area that I've seen people make mistakes is not feeling like they need that centralized message, that they all know what they're saying, and that they don't need to bring that all together. And so when that happens, you have people off saying their own versions of the mission and of their message, and it's not cohesive. And so being able to bring that all together and make sure that whether you're the president and CEO, the head of school, one of the volunteer leaders, a director of development, but you're all taking from the same story and being able to share those key things, that's going to make your message more impactful.
Great. I think one of the mistakes that I see frequently is not enough organizations convey their mission down to the manner in which it changes lives. And I've long held the belief that people give to changed lives and the way that they see missions impacting lives. And it's one thing to describe the mission at a 30,000 foot level, but it's another thing to talk about how they are transforming a life in some profound way, which I see that missing most frequently in the work that we do.
That heartstrings.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I know that there are many different versions of stories, and this may pick up on some of the mistakes that you guys talked about, but I've been a part of many client organizations in our serving them when they have gone through elevator speech organizations. They'll bring in storytelling consultants to help them kind of go through these exercises. And what's interesting is most of those organizations, most of the stories that they end up telling answer a different question necessarily than we need. I hear them answering the question, why do we exist? How is answering the question, why do we exist, different than what we need, which is answering the question, why do we need funding, why do we need more funding? Anybody want to take a stab at that?
Sure. I guess at the fundamental level, it's a different audience to a degree. When you're pitching, whether it's to a board or a group that you want to rally around you to start a new organization, that's vision casting for something that's missing in the space that you want to step in and fill that void. It's a different audience when it's a donor base or a prospect base that you're trying to say, we've stepped into this void, and now for us to continue to make an impact, this is the gap. This is what we need. This is what we're not able to do. It's the conflict, right? If you can't tell the conflict that you're experiencing and that your donors can help solve, then they're not hearing the right message. So to me, that's the fundamental difference is, are we launching something new where we've got to convince people we're filling a void versus what's the conflict of right now and how we're executing our mission today to make that different, that heartstrings connection.
You just raised a really important word there, and that is conflict. We think of the word conflict in our daily life. Sometimes it means the spat that you have with your spouse before you leave the house in the morning.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
Never.
Never happens in our house. Conflict, we're talking about in this context as being kind of that critical element of what comprises every story. And so let's see if we can do this collectively. But we got to think back to our 11th grade creative writing course. But what are the key elements of any story? Right, conflict being one.
Characters.
The plot.
Yeah.
Plot, characters. Yeah.
Theme, resolution.
Okay, I think that's pretty close. So obviously the three most important
One more.
setting. Okay. The most important of all of those is the conflict, and that's what tends to be missing sometimes in the stories that our nonprofit clients tell. You guys have you ever known somebody that just can't tell a story?
No.
No, I think every organization has somebody that you're careful about asking them a question because they just start talking and then 20 minutes later they're still talking and you don't know really what they've been talking about.
The thing that I see more frequently is I just want to tell you the good news. I want to tell you all the great things that we're doing, and that's wonderful. Those are things that are inspiring for how you're doing as an organization, but going back to the why that you were asking earlier, if you don't tell me what the challenge is, what problem I'm solving, then I don't really know that you need my help, because otherwise it just sounds like, oh, you're doing great. Mm-hmm. Yeah. keep at it.
So what are kinds of conflict that organizations, nonprofit missions could talk about?
If they're out of space and you get to the point where you can't serve the demographic that you're there to serve, you can't fulfill your mission because you don't have the room. And so having a donor see that, and you don't want to make sure that they've got that front row parking when they come to visit. Yes, from a donor relations standpoint, stewardship, you want them to have that experience. No, let them see the problem. Let them park a block away to show, oh my gosh, we don't have room for everybody. And so we need more room. Making them the hero of that story and being able to show the urgency and that need is so important. Because if you just tell them all the good things about who you are and what's led you to this part, you're not vision casting for how you're going to solve X, Y, and Z, but then grow from there.
Okay. I think another type of conflict that every organization is facing is just the limited dollars, right? I don't know any organization in our work that would tell you, no, we don't need any more money, we're good. We're solid, thanks though. They all have things that are of greater need to them within the organization. And so being able to dig into those specific needs is where that kind of conflict opportunity element comes from, that drives we need more funding in order to do this thing that we're not otherwise going to be able to do. If it's not for you, we can't X.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, Scott, by explaining the conflict that exists in every nonprofit organization, which is no organization is content operating at the level they are today. They all want to have a broader, bigger mission. They want to figure out a way to reach more people or reach the people that they're reaching in a more impactful way. And the answer to that challenge is always funding, and unfortunately it is. And so there's not a nonprofit organization in the world that doesn't have this same story to tell in their own unique way. Is why do we need more money? And it can't be for the sake of having more money. It has to be so that we can impact people's lives in a more significant and profound way. And that is the common conflict that all nonprofit organizations seem to have. The other way that we oftentimes kind of build storytelling into the nonprofit clients that we have is telling a story around engaging a specific donor as opposed to just the funding operation itself. So the story that I tell you about XYZ organization here may be why we need more money, but the story that I tell you, or you as a donor to this particular organization, now I have to scale the conflict down to something that you can resolve. So talk a little bit about how we do that and the importance of being able to scale a story down to a donor's level.
Any one of us could start to talk about our own lives, whether it's our background, what we do professionally, interests we have, and we're going to talk about different things. And so taking a story that for an organization that is very complex, because there are a lot of organizations that their overarching story, all the details that go in it, there's a lot of complexity to it. But to identify, Schuyler, I know that this is your area of passion. This within our organization, this is your sweet spot. For us to be able to say as fundraisers, this is the connection, this is the sweet spot of that donor, and what we do in our mission is where the personalization of the story happens. And that allows you to take 80% of the rest of the information about the organization and not just put it away, but not make it the most important piece. You're focusing the most important piece on exactly what that person is interested in or what pulls their heartstrings the most.
Interesting. Yeah.
I think you speak their language. And when you know your donor and you're able to put them in that story to help solve the problem or, again, make them be the hero, that pulls on their heartstrings in a way that they see themselves being an answer. And so when the donor can see themselves as the answer, you're going to have an even more empowered giving and giving experience.
Yeah, I think of examples where, it seems to me that donors want to be problem solvers. And when they can see a problem that they personally can solve and make that kind of impact, it becomes very appealing to them. I've heard stories that clients would tell me where they're walking a donor just on a tour of their organization, and they might be in the basement, and they would say, "This is our boiler, which is kind of on its last leg. It's already showing signs of, and that's going to be we know that's a major cost that we have coming up." And the donor stopping them and saying, "What's that going to cost?" And them saying, "Well, it's probably going to be upwards of $50,000 to put that in." And they said, and later that day, as they're finishing their meeting over coffee, the donor saying, "Why don't I fund that boiler for you?" When they see a problem that exists for the organization, and when they see an opportunity to solve it, that becomes theirs, and they have their handprints all over it, and that becomes magical for a donor. Granted, there's not that. Boilers aren't all that sexy, right? But there's other things that are much cooler.
But I think that points to a myth that permeates our industry, that you shouldn't talk about the things that are within your budget, that are just everyday, got to run the organization type of expenses. We assume too much and too often that, donors won't fund this because it's not sexy, or it's keeping the lights on. Well, if the donor is passionate about your organization, your ministry, whatever it might be, then they're passionate about funding it, any part of it. So don't restrict the conflict that you're demonstrating, you're showing, the story that you're telling, because of an assumption or a preconceived notion that we have. Let them tell you what they're not interested in. I mean, that example you gave, they could have just walked right by the boiler and said, "Oh man, that's a bummer," and kept walking.
Yeah, boilers don't do it for me.
Right, but because you never know, you've got to introduce what that conflict is, or what those opportunities are, and let them decide.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find, especially when organizations are in relationship with their donors, they understand kind of what their passions and interests are. And if you're a school and you have a donor who is particularly interested, maybe they work in a science field, maybe they're a scientist of some kind, then why wouldn't you try to engage them in some aspect dealing with the science labs at your school? And there's a budget relating to that, whether it's lab supplies, or replenishing the chemicals in a chemistry lab, or buying a new microscope or something like that. Those are all things that schools have to budget for, that could very easily be packaged and presented. And to your point, it's taking the stuff that normally gets covered by the budget, and brings them kind of alive to a donor. So part of what we've been talking about right now is telling a story for an organization, communicating their needs, their recurring operational needs, their annual giving needs. Obviously, one of the big reasons we get retained by our clients is to help them with an extraordinary need, a capital need, or startup resources or something like that. And so let's talk about how the story might be different, and how much more compelling it might be, or the lack thereof, in that kind of context.
Yeah, to me, the biggest difference that you can see is that you're going back to that vision casting opportunity. It's not just running the organization on a daily basis, or help us fill this budget gap or this budget need on an annual operating. Now it's, how do we take that hyper jump to the next version of who we're going to be as an organization, or the next group that we're going to serve, or the next ministry we're going to launch. It turns the story into casting a vision for something that has not come yet.
That's so true. Capital campaigns oftentimes are all about seizing opportunities and taking on new mission that doesn't exist today, whereas annual fund is about funding what's already there. So I suppose it would be analogous to, how excited do you get about the money that you use to pay the electric bill versus the money that you have to take a vacation, right? They're come out of two different pockets, or at least budgeting process.
Yep.
I have a client that I'm working with right now who's in the middle of a capital campaign, and in talking with them, there are some donors that they have, and in trying to establish trust, these donors are sharing some thoughts that they have about the priorities and why aren't teacher salaries and bathrooms and things that are usually included in that annual fund, in that operating budget. Why is that not included in the capital campaign? Well, trying to talk with them about, but this goes beyond what your annual fund is. That is what your gala helps. That is what your end of year appeal helps. This is even more than that. And how are we going to help you grow the infrastructure that you need for the next 25 years? And so this is a building, not a let's fix what we have. How are we making it better?
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great point that you raised, Katie, and it is the importance of every organization drawing a very clear distinction between what is recurring operational needs and the story that they have to tell to raise those funds, because you're probably right, they probably do need to improve faculty salaries. They probably do need to invest in more of the things that are recurring and operating needs. At the same time, the extraordinary needs present opportunities sometimes, in the case of a school, to grow enrollment and thereby help the financial model that might bolster those other things, right? I suppose. And so in that weird way, the two stories become sort of interwoven, that one story sort of helps resolve the other story, or the other conflict in the other story.
Well, and I know this isn't about campaigns, but it's important to how you tell the story, because you do have a lot of donors who are integral to funding those operational needs throughout the year, and you've got to make sure that you can tell that story to that donor of, hey, we still have to fund these needs this year, but we also have to do something extraordinary. It's not one or the other. We have to do both.
Mm-hmm. Obviously, one of the outcomes of campaigns is they sometimes result in the largest gifts that a donor has given in his or her lifetime. Annual gifts don't usually produce that kind of fruit, and you have to believe that it's tied to the compelling nature of the stories, because I say to organizations all the time, the easiest money you'll ever raise is capital, because it represents some shiny new thing that doesn't exist today, and it represents opportunity and opportunities for expansion of the mission and things like that. Whereas your annual fund is like investing in remodeling and reinvesting back into the existing mission. It's sort of like it's not very fun to pay for a new transmission in your old car. It's much more fun to go out and buy a new car. So I think that same kind of mental thought translates into the manner in which people typically try to make their decisions and how they hear the stories. Let me circle back, because the most common story that exists in the nonprofit world is the one that they have to tell related to their ongoing funding operation, the recurring operational needs. So what are some ways, what are some ideas and thoughts that we can all share with our audience to help them better tell that story?
I think in one way, being direct in your storytelling, that this is in addition to what you already give. I think being able to show them that what they're giving annually matters, because without that, again, going back to we got to keep our doors open, we got to keep the boiler going, that's important. But for us to get to this vision that we're casting, this story that we're sharing about where we can go, we need bigger. We need you to invest in us more. We need that impact that you're going to help us create.
Great. Yeah, the operational needs never cease. And so there's always a need to talk to a donor and tell them a story in a way that yes, this is what you've always done for us, but we're growing, or the need has increased, or the costs have changed. There's a story there for why and how you talk about the growth of the organization and the growth that is needed out of them and helping to fund that. To me, fundamentally, we are creatures of growth, right? I mean, we get bigger, we grow up, we mature, and everything that we do in our lives is about growth. We grow in our education, we grow in our careers. It is our instinct to want to get close to or get involved with or help in making something else grow. And you've got to tell a story that helps people see how they can help you grow.
Katie, to kind of tie back to the school scenario that you were describing earlier, because we serve so many schools, and operational funding for schools is oftentimes, or most frequently, a very small piece of their revenue pie, right? So, obviously most schools are tuition revenue driven, with the idea that maybe philanthropy has to cover 5 to 20% of their annual budget. And so sometimes they struggle with the way to make that so compelling, when reality is fundraising is not the primary funder of the broader mission. And one of the ways that we've learned to talk about that I stole from a colleague who's part of the production crew today is defining that as their margin of excellence. Mm-hmm. In other words, if you look at a school that relies on 10% of their revenue to come from fundraising, what would happen if they didn't have that 10%? What would go away? And truth is, the school would probably still survive. They would just have to cut all the cool programs, the field trips, the extracurricular, co-curricular activities that are funded through their primary revenue, maybe some of the sports and fine arts activities that cost money. And when you look at those things and you say, what's the difference between having those things and not? The difference is between a bare bones, private education and a transformational experience for their kids. Mm-hmm. So then you can really quantify exactly what that fundraising does. And it becomes a very compelling story that you can tell about how these things enhance the experience that the kids have in the school.
They can also relate it to what they're seeing in their own world. If you look at the public school arena, if you looked at the comparison between what does a private school education, not just education, but what does that experience look like, and then what's happening in the public school world, one of the things that we've seen over the last 2 decades is a shrinking budget towards arts and other extracurricular programming. I know that's not true in every district, but in a lot of the larger districts, that's the crunch that comes. Private schools are not any different in that if funding has to start to be cut, it's going to go to those programs that are not fundamental to education. And it's not just schools. Every organization has that, right? If you run a ministry and you're doing a certain kind of outreach, you might have to cut that outreach if you have to cut your funding. You may have to narrow the scope of the impact that you're having as a ministry. So everybody's going to have to, if they don't get that funding, all of a sudden you're doing a red pen, what we call the red pen exercise, right? Getting a red pen to your budget and taking those things off that you can't afford to do. There's your conflict. There's the story that you've got to tell your donors. If we don't get gifts from committed donors like you, this is what we lose.
Good. So I'll give you a minute to think of your summation comments, but we'll kind of go around the horn here. And I'll start just by offering a couple of things, but just trying to sum up this thing we call, telling the story or making the case, as it were, for a nonprofit mission. What I would offer is simply this, that it's not that complicated of a task. But it has to have the key elements if it's going to be an interesting story to tell. So it has to have a great plot, it has to have defined conflict, and it has to have a resolution in the story. And if those three elements are present, it's going to be an interesting story to tell. The funding should always be the conflict and what the need for funding represents in terms of how that impacts your mission and how that impacts your ability to change lives. Scott?
We talked a lot about conflict in this series, and I could imagine if I'm watching this, I'm thinking there's so much more to a story than just conflict. But as you just pointed out, it's the quintessential element, though. Without communicating that conflict, what that need is, nothing else matters. You can be doing the greatest stuff in the world, but if you can't tell somebody why you need what you need and how incredibly important it is, they don't know that you need them. And if they don't know that you need them, someone else is telling them, I need you.
You need a story. You need a story that is centralized and that makes sense and that's clear and concise. You need something that is not only the elevator pitch, but something that can be taken from to speak to each individual donor so that they can see themselves answering that conflict. Everybody needs to be able to have the same message so that they can then share it in the same way. Making it theirs, we're all about authenticity, but the same message is so important. So if you think you have it on your website, take another look at it. It may need to be deeper. It doesn't just live on a website. There's more to it than that.
Thanks for joining us for this first episode of our Summer Break series, Season 2. This is all about, again, telling the story. Stay tuned for our forthcoming episodes around our prospect base and around our storytellers, and then lastly around the plan that sort of sticks all this stuff together.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of our Summer Break series, Summer School Edition. We are excited to hear from you and hope that you will submit questions about anything you heard today that you may want to know more about. We've set up a special place for you to do that at missionadvancement.com/summer break. So go to our website, missionadvancement.com/summer break, submit your questions, and a member of the Mission Advancement team will answer them via video on social media over the summer. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again next week.